There's a war going on. A war between gamers and the games industry. And if Fallout has taught us anything about war, war never changes. And one thing that remains constant with all wars, whether it be a war of words or a physical war, it's the misinformation that is spread and the lack of knowledge about what the other side is actually experiencing. Now, I'm going to be stepping into this minefield, hoping to diffuse the situation a little bit and kind of offer a view from all sides. And today we're going to be starting with this multiple part series with the games industry and talking about things gamers don't understand about the games industry. Now, for this conversation to make sense, you need to understand a few principles of modern consumerism. The first of which is known as the spoiled consumer. Basically, consumers have come to the point where they expect a specific level of service, no matter what industry. So no longer are you competing for satisfaction with your competitors in your own industry, but you're competing with all industries when it comes to things like customer service. This is largely a result of companies like Amazon changing the way we shop, and returns especially have largely affected many online retailers, Amazon's return policy being so generous. Netflix and the quality of streaming has raised people's expectation of tech and other things like that. So now not only are these companies competing for space and for recognition in their industry, but now it's a global competition. Now, typically, this has also had upsides. People have become more educated about most industries that they partake and consume in. However, that hasn't rung true for most of games, and that's mostly on the game devs side. That's mostly their fault, because a lot of us haven't taken the effort to educate our consumers and have kind of hidden our numbers, hidden all the data that could be useful for them to understand what our industry is like. So I'm going to be talking about as much as I can, kind of explaining these things that devs really need to teach consumers. Now, this conversation will be focusing on the AAA industry specifically, and I'll be doing one about the indie industry later. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the cost of production. This is actually very interesting, especially because I want to do it in the light of the treatment of most employees in the AAA industry. You see, devs aren't in a great situation. A lot of people actually assume that devs are rich and have great lives. They get to work on games. I mean, how fun is that? However, the industry is actually mistreating its employees in quite serious ways that you couldn't get away with in any other industry. This is most obvious in the way overtime is treated. Many devs in the AAA industry, especially around the release of a game, are basically never leaving the office. And I mean that seriously. A lot of people are actually sleeping in the offices, if they sleep at all, near the end of the game. And they're not being paid extra for it largely. I mean, there's a couple of exceptions. However, in general, employees aren't paid for this extra time they're putting in. Additionally, even though a lot of people look at the average salary of a game dev, and it's fairly decent. I mean, usually six figures. However, for the area that a lot of the game devs are concentrating in, that's actually lower than the median for the area. And actually, that's the same actually for a lot of tech industry, not just the games. A lot of tech is like this as well for mid-level developers. A lot of people have taken to essentially living in vans in the city because they simply can't afford rent for the area they're in. And additionally, they can't afford rent anywhere within the area where they can make it to work on time. This has essentially led to homelessness, a large rate of homelessness among devs. You couple that with the kind of volatility of the jobs, depending on your job, especially testers, they're laid off in mass whenever a game is finished. Many devs have to look for a new job or have months where they don't have anything to do and aren't being paid. Now, this has been addressed in some big companies are working on this. However, it's still prominent. So you may be wondering, why is this important to understanding the industry? And simply put, the cost of games are largely reduced due to this mistreatment. So that leads us to our next point, which is that the cost of games is rising massively, and a lot of us keep our profits and our costs hidden from consumers, which is actually a huge problem. People don't realize that games are starting to cost more than most major production movies, TV shows. This is getting ridiculously expensive, millions of dollars to develop these AAA games. This, coupled with the fact that many companies are at max workflow. Now, there's always, adjustments that can be made to be better and more efficient. However, in general, they're highly efficient. They've come up with workflows that work for their game company. That, and the fact that they have established tools, engines that they can use that greatly save on dev cost and time, and you're still spending these millions and millions of dollars, plus team size expansion is increasing massively. These games, the higher quality is requiring more people to work, which is exponentially increasing the cost of production. Now, many industries could get away with this by simply increasing the production time. However, this doesn't work in the games industry because a lot of budgets are on a razor's edge for a lot of these studios. Now, a lot of people like to look at the biggest companies in the industry, EA, Microsoft, and say, well, Nintendo actually is a huge example here. They look at these companies and they say, well, they're able to do it. Why aren't all these other people able to do it? Why can't they just push back the release of the game a year? And the answer is usually that they don't have the money to do it. There's not a lot of free cash flow in games. There's a very tight budgeting to make a game, and if you don't finish in production time, and you don't start that cash flow coming in, a lot of these places go out of business. We've seen actually several highly influential studios lately go out of business. The most recent that I can think of is Telltale, of course, and that trend will continue unless something changes. As this cost of production is rising, and as the income isn't rising to match, it's causing a lot of strain. Now, to kind of highlight how people don't understand the economics of the games industry, one of the conversations I've had recently online, which I spend a lot of time kind of talking with people to trying to promote understanding of the games industry, they compared EA and the strategies they could take versus Bethesda. Now, for a lot of gamers, that may seem like a valid comparison. They may seem like similar size companies. However, that isn't true if you look at the numbers. The games industry is worth about $152.1 billion estimated for this year. Now, EA's estimation for this year is $22.9 billion, whereas Bethesda is estimated to be about $2.5 billion. Now, the both of those are very high numbers for a normal person, for an average person. However, if you look at the industry percentage, you're talking about EA that's somewhere between 10 and 15% of the industry's worth, whereas Bethesda, on the other hand, is somewhere between 0.5 and 1.5%, depending on the estimate. That isn't comparable. That's like comparing Walmart to your family grocery store down the street. Now, there's a couple other important numbers to understand, namely free cash flow, which EA actually has one of the healthiest in the industry, at least according to what they've reported to investors, versus Bethesda, who has a much, much smaller percentage of free cash flow. Basically, EA is able to throw a lot more money at a project and at advertising versus Bethesda. Bethesda doesn't have the money to do the kind of developments that EA can, which specifically this conversation was about why Bethesda shouldn't switch engines, which is a complex subject I'll be talking a little bit more on in a minute. But basically it comes down to the fact that EA has a lot more cash, a ton more that they can spend percentage after their projects have been paid for versus Bethesda. And that's true for most of the games industry. A lot of them really don't have the free cash flow beyond paying for their next game and general expenses. After that, there's very, very little left over. So this kind of brings me to my next major point, which is the workflow of game design and game development isn't really well known to consumers. I want to talk about a specific example that's kind of been in the spotlight in the last couple days, which is Games Freak with the Pokemon series. You see, game development is actually a much more involved and difficult process than what most people assume. If you actually work on even a game jam game, a tiny game, you'll know how difficult making a game truly is. Now, Game Freak made the decision to essentially cut a feature that's been in all the Pokemon games up to this point, which is the National Dex. And that caused a lot of controversy for several reasons, which I'll get into. However, the first one I want to talk about is simply that 1,000 Pokemon now, essentially 1,000 Pokemon, is not a sustainable model. The 1,000 unique objects is very difficult to manage. My own game is getting close to a couple hundred, maybe 200, and already it's a lot of work to keep everything maintained, and taking that to a new game will be difficult. Now imagine that with thousands and upon thousands of assets to redo, to rebalance, and to reanimate. It's just simply not sustainable, especially considering that the team size at Games Freak is actually minuscule compared to the average in the industry. Even for the product that they're making, which realistically isn't as large as a lot of these games, it's just not a sustainable model. Their profitability isn't high enough to merit the continual exponential growth of this Dex. And it was an inevitable outcome, actually. If you look at it from a technical and design perspective, eventually that was going to happen. But there's a lot of reasons why this actually can be good for gamers, which I'm not going to dive into in this video. There's a lot of design principles that I think made it a great choice. However, I want to focus more on the technical side. Now, the reason I want to talk specifically about the Pokemon games and Game Freak is the whole hashtag Game Freak lied thing, the whole controversy surrounding the game. It's kind of a weird kind of limbo right now where almost everyone I've met that have actually played the game love it, but there's a lot of people complaining about it that haven't actually bought the game or played the game. And I kind of want to talk about specifically how that might have happened. Now, I don't know for sure. There's a lot of things that happen in the game industry that are behind closed doors. But a lot of times when these kind of miscommunications happen, it's not that they lie, it's that usually something's lost in translation somewhere. And a lot of that comes to do with the fact that the games industry is massively diverse when it comes to industry facets that you may be involved in. A lot of places will use some of the more common ones are things like music, programming, you got artists, you got marketing, you've got the business people that are totally separate from the development process of the game. And, there's more niche things like historians or combat experts that get called in, actors, and a lot of this leads to a difficulty communicating. It's very hard because each of these industries, each of these disciplines has their own language, and a lot of times it can be difficult translating from one to the other. In fact, there's entire people hired that's their job, and even then it still happens regularly. And a lot of it just comes from the pure size of the amount of people. If you've ever had to manage a team of more than like 3 people, it gets harder and harder the larger it goes. So a lot of times when people say these things, it's a result of either a miscommunication, people misunderstand what they're saying. I saw that a lot, especially with Fallout 76, where people were saying, they said this would be in the game, but if you look at it, they said, no, that's not in the game, but then a bunch of people got hyped about that feature that never was planned, and it goes downhill. And I'm not saying Fallout 76 was a perfect or great game, I'm just saying that it does happen, and a lot of this is to the detriment of a lot of games. And great games and bad games alike get either more love or hate than they should. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that people just don't understand how to talk to each other across these disciplines. Another common issue is game development is fluid. A lot of times a feature will be planned from the beginning and it will get cut weeks before launch, or even just the couple days before. Sometimes things just don't fit and they get cut, and sometimes you promise things that you're planning that you think will work and have worked in your prototype phase, But then when you get to the actual production phase, things just get cut, or deadlines that devs don't set. People act like the devs are the ones choosing the release dates, but most of the time it's not. Especially, well, always in the AAA industry, and sometimes in the indie industry if you have a publisher. You see, you have to finish these things by a specific time, and sometimes you were planning on doing something and it just doesn't happen because there's just not time or money to get it done. Those are just a couple of things that could have happened. There's a lot more that could have happened, including they might have actually lied. However, I think it's fair to take in consideration things that may have happened. Now, a lot of times when I tell people this, their response is, well, they're pros. They should have planned for that. They should have known that would happen. And that's not really fair, because it is basically, well, it is impossible to accurately predict a lot of the time and money that goes into the development. Now, we've gotten pretty good at making educated guesses, but as anyone that's ever worked on a game will tell you, the scope always needs to shrink. The costs always go on. The development always runs longer than you think. And even with generous margins calculated in, you're still going to have issues. You're going to have problems that pop up that you just take a lot longer to fix than you expected. That's just the way it goes. It's just a fact of the industry. Now, the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to this subject is the misunderstanding of how the tools of game and dev work. Specifically, as I mentioned earlier, my whole conversation with engines. I've noticed that a lot of people don't understand what a game engine is, what its purpose is, and therefore end up arguing that some technical issue means an engine needs to be changed, without understanding the impact that would actually have. Specifically, I want to talk about Bethesda and their engine that gets plenty of online hate. However, from a development's perspective, yeah, it's got issues. Every engine has its weaknesses. However, it also has very, very valid strengths. And it does undergo overhauls. With Fallout 76, they had to completely redo what they called the Atlas system, which is basically the game loaded around the player, which wouldn't work with an online game. And that will be great for games moving forward. It will allow Bethesda to do a lot more with the engine, which is how engines develop. That's how they change. Game engines have been being used for 20 plus, 14, 15, 20 years, and still produce amazing pieces of art and work, simply because engines aren't just a software program. They're a collection of libraries and tools and your physics engine. All of that is wrapped up into one package where the devs can work from. So basically, at any point, any of these modules inside of that engine can be ripped out and redone and replaced. So a lot of people say, well, why don't they fix the bugs that are currently in every game they make? Well, a lot of that often comes down to the fact that bug hunting is actually a very difficult process, and fixing them is even more difficult, and a lot of these aren't game-breaking. Now, they try to hunt down game-breaking bugs, and it's kind of an inevitability with a project of the sizes that we're reaching. There will be bugs that they don't find. It's not that they were lazy, it's just that QA is hard. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money, and you miss things. A great story I like to tell about this is when I was going to school, there was somebody next to me in the class, and we were very bored, simply because the class that they're making us take was useless for 90% of the class, because most of us have been doing it for years, but there was no way to test out. Anyways, he started making a small game, simply just like a kind of first-person multiplayer shooter for network, split-screen deal. And in the game, there was like 5 entities, 6 entities. I think there was like 3 types of guns, a grenade, and the players, and I think a flag. So it's a very small project. You would think it's very easy to debug. But one day, after he had finished and was going to show it to some friends, me and him had been playing and bug testing this thing pretty much the entire time. And he first showed his friends this, and they ran into this massive fatal error where if a grenade was hit in air by the sniper rifle specifically, it would cause a bunch of grenades just spawn and continually spawn and fill up the entire game room. It had something to do with movement. We eventually found it and were able to get it working. However, that was a tiny game. Yet, something like that, something that's maybe a 1 in a million people will run into, is very easy to miss on a project the scale of the games Bethesda make, which they make some of the biggest games in the industry right now. I like to say changing engines kills games, and it's generally true. It's not a rule 100% of the time. However, in general, the cost of making an engine is high, and the time investment is extremely high. It can take up to 5 years to get a solid enough game engine for some of these AAA games. But in doing so, you lose some of what the old engine was, specifically game feel. Especially for Bethesda, with their very unique physics engine that they use, it leads to a very, very specific feel and atmosphere that fans have come to expect and love. And by changing the engine, they'll lose that uniqueness, and they don't want that. That's why they love those games. Additionally, the time it takes to learn a new engine is 2 years to become adept easily, especially with something new for large companies. That's how long it took Kingdom Hearts 3 to adjust. The team that worked on Kingdom Hearts 3, they spent about 2 years trying to learn the engine, 5-year development time. 2 years of that was specifically working on learning this new engine, and the end result didn't really please fans. A lot of people were mad, and I kind of didn't enjoy it that much either. The gameplay felt... even though the combat looked smooth, it didn't feel as strategic as some of the old games, even on the harder difficulties. And it just kind of alienated a lot of people. And on top of that, they had the whole corporate issues with working with Disney and, no Final Fantasy characters, all those kind of things that caused more anger, which in the end comes down to business structure being complicated to work around, especially when it comes to licensing. But beyond that, the game just didn't feel like the same, and that was due to the shift in engines. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is how social changes have actually influenced the games industry. Specifically, we're going to start with nostalgia, which is a very powerful, emotion that people experience, and it ends up with people romanticizing the past. They remember games as they used to be, how they were so much better than now, but that's not really objectively true. Games are appealing to a larger and larger market. More people are playing games. There's less of these niche markets, whereas old games used to rely on niche markets, much like indies do now today. AAAs can't make enough money appealing to simply a niche audience. That's why a lot of this feels like it's not my game, it's someone else's game. A lot of that just comes from the fact that they're trying to get as many people to play as possible because it's the only financially viable option. And a lot of times nostalgia interferes with that strategy simply because we get attached to things we like. Another thing that's changed is the target market. Even games like Call of Duty that rated M, 17 plus, they're clearly targeted at people under 18. That's the major market there. That's where the most money is coming from right now. And realistically, you have to cater to that audience. So older gamers will be left behind as far as design and monetization practice goes. Because we're not the people that matter anymore when it comes to making money, which all companies need to do. You can't expect the games companies to not make money. That's just unrealistic. The expenses in the industry are high. And so they have to target the market that's going to make them money. And since we're used to a different style, we're used to a different design approach, these tiny teams building tiny games that they love, these passion projects, just isn't viable for the AAA industry. That's why we have the industry, the indie industry as it is because we rely a lot on the nostalgia. That's why so many pixel art games exist in the indie industry. Another massive development that has influenced the way people talk and hear about games is, social media, mass communication. People can say things. A lot of times a vocal minority can lead the narrative simply because they're shouting louder. People are more reactive to anger, to loud people, just look at YouTube, that's why a lot of the more popular peoples are so loud, is simply because that's what people respond to. That's what they listen to. And it's easier to give in to the doubt than it is to be hopeful. Simply put, it's human nature. And because of that, we get these movements, this anger, this hate on games, specific games, almost every time. And it's not that the critique isn't like deserving. It's not that the critique is always wrong. Rather, there's no more live and let live type attitude. It's not your game. I hate XCOM. I cannot stand that style of game. I hate playing it. It's boring to me, but I would never say it's a bad game just because it's not my game. It's not a game I want to play, but it is a high quality game. It's a high quality series that produces good work that people love, and that's all that really matters in the end. Let people enjoy what they want to enjoy, and this is growing more. It's becoming kind of a cultural movement to dislike popular things, and that happens regularly. It's a pretty predictable pattern of human interaction, actually. It's just important to recognize that, and recognize that the full story isn't the anger, that there's a lot of other emotions that need to be shared. And that's why it's kind of become the most viable strategy to just ignore the hate. We see that with Fallout 76 moving forward. They continue to publish updates for the fans that they have. They're not forcing this game on people. The people act like a company making a game means they have to buy it, and that the company is forcing it down their throats because they marketed it. That's not true. Nobody's forcing you to play. They're creating something that they think some people will like. And that's my approach to making games as well, is creating something I would like. And they're just creating something they think people will like. Just because a lot of people don't, doesn't mean that people won't. You just gotta let people play what they want to play. Now, this is where that spoiled consumer I was talking about at the start of the video starts to come in. Because now games are being compared across genres, RPGs and shooters competing for the same audience, even though they're realistically different products, and they're being rated as if they are the same product just because they share the medium. They're also competing, with every other industry as well, anything people spend their money on. So it's a very rough space to work in. It's not easy to stay. That's why we see so many people leaving the industry. It's simply because it's a very stressful and competitive market. The place where I see this honestly the most often, and kind of part of the issues, is game journalism doesn't understand the industry any more than the consumer, which hasn't been the case largely for a lot of art forms in the past. Which is unfortunate, because we have journalists propagating these rumors, these falsehoods, simply because they don't understand the market, which is unfortunate. I can't tell you how many times I've read a story about some technical difficulties or some issues or social issues or clapback, from a developer, where the journalist goes on this self-important rant about how they are the consumer and they're not connecting with consumers. A lot of times the ratings from journalists and consumers don't match. And they also aren't devs. They don't understand the industry. And it's led to this really weird, recognition as experts, despite the evidence that they're really not. That most of them don't understand at all what they're talking about. And it's kind of unfortunate. It's led to a lot of misinformation being spread, which makes it a lot harder to control than, the information that you're sharing about your game. You can say one thing, and all of a sudden an opinion journalist is taken as an official source when they were just writing a guess about what your game might be, and suddenly you're the one that told them that, even though what you said and what they said were nowhere near the same thing. It's similar to the communication within the industry, only worse. It gets so much worse. Now, I kind of want to sum up what this video's points are. First, devs are mistreated by both the industry and by gamers because gamers aren't educated in what the industry is like. This misinformation is continually spread through journalists that are seen as experts in their field, yet have no understanding of the field that they're reviewing. Profits are very thin, even though it's a huge growing industry, and it seems like there's a lot of money there. A lot of it's eaten up by very specific large companies, leaving a lot of AAA games actually produced by very small teams. The amount of work that goes into a game is far greater than anyone outside the industry thinks. And so are the costs. I'm not saying that the game industry doesn't deserve any critique. Not at all. In fact, there are very, very, very difficult issues that are being dealt with. There's a lot of ethical issues that we're working through as designers. But you have to realize that mistakes are inevitable. This is an art. It's not an industry. It's not a science. There's no way to just make a good game. People will make mistakes, and the design won't always be what you want. But that doesn't mean that you need to act as if it's a personal offense to you. Learn the difficulties and learn how to understand what the industry is like so that you can have valid critique. If you want to be heard, be worthy of being heard. Now, my channel is generally centered around indie devs especially, so we need to start spreading this information. A lot of us in the indie community tend to be very hostile towards the AAA industry, many times because we were either mistreated or know people that were mistreated in the industry, and simply because it's good business. If we portray ourselves as the anti-AAA, then we're going to get more love than we realistically would otherwise. However, we need to, if we want to increase the valid critique in the world, and if we want to increase the validity of our art form and the quality of the art form, we need people that know what it's like. We need gamers to understand what they're experiencing and what went into making it. And that will be better for indie as well as AAA. So I encourage you to try to help other people and try to help other people understand this industry, because it will be better for all of us. Now, this is just the surface. This is just the first video in this series. Next time, I'm going to be talking kind of why consumers feel the way they do, and valid ways we can kind of help accommodate that and fix that. And yeah, I hope to see you guys next video. Thanks for watching.